Hello, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Excited for the session.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. I'll probably wait to share my screen until we
Sure. Sure.
start. Yeah. So the other conference that I attend that is often on this hop-in platform, which is why I
Uh-huh.
perform pretty decently, is the Write the Docs conference. And
Hmm.
they don't have like a band, but they have community members who submit their band's music that they
Oh,
play between sessions.
that's a great idea.
I know, right? What we need to do is like get the Saltines to record some filler music, and
Absolutely.
then we could like have it during these sessions, right? So
Oh, I love it. Yep.
yeah.
All right, for joining. This is Growing a Healthy DevOps Community Inside Self Project. I'm with Alyssa Rock, and we will wait till maybe a minute after to get started.
Is my audio okay?
Yeah, it's great. It sounds like it's coming from your headset. So
Yes. So should be good.
sometimes just picking the right audio devices is the tricky part, right?
Yeah, it's true. Do we usually start right at time or do we give it a couple of minutes?
I usually just wait 30 seconds into the hour or something.
No worries.
Thanks everyone for joining. We'll wait till a couple minutes, a couple seconds after we get started. Did you get your swag box yet?
I never got mine. Did you get yours?
Yesterday, yeah.
Yesterday. Oh man. That's too bad. I had hoped to wear my Salt Comp shirt today, but I'll just dress professionally instead.
That works. No harm in that. Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
Yes.
shipping delays. Yeah.
Yes. Hans.
I hadn't thought that these could be sent all over the world. You know,
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to hear who got what when. You know,
Hmm.
and track it. You see those blog articles of the people taking the Apple tracker and like watching their package go everywhere.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, okay, Nick.
It's Nick. Hi, Nick.
Oh, I think we can probably get started.
VIP. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So welcome everyone to this the talk growing a healthy DevOps community inside Salt project. I think you all chose the right thing to attend this hour. I'm excited for this. So a quick introduction of Alyssa. After having worked on the Salt config documentation for 2 years this December, um, she's excited to begin a new role as Salt technical writer. And as we see from her talk, she's passionate about open source and is excited for the opportunity to make Salt easier to learn and use. In addition to her responsibilities at Vmware, she serves as the chair of the Good Docs Project, a global open source community with more than 50 software engineers and technical writers devoted to creating templates, tools, and resources for documentation in open source software. She also coordinates the Write the Docs Quorum program for US, Canada, and Australia, which provides quarterly online educational events for a community with hundreds of passionate documentarians who want to learn and improve their craft. Awesome. We are excited to jump right into this. Alyssa, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to make sure I share system audio because I will be sharing video clips today. So you're going to see a blank screen to start, but it will populate in just a moment. Okay, so let me switch to my notes. There we go. Okay, well, thank you, Dave, and thank you to Chunga. I don't know if he's here, but I'm thanking him anyway for giving me the opportunity to speak. Today, I'm going to talk about growing a healthy DevOps community inside the SALT project. So, for a long time now, I've been, I need to switch which screen I'm active on. For a long time now, I've been interested in magical places. And I'm not talking about fake magical places like Hogwarts and the Land of Oz. I'm talking about real magical places. These are actual physical locations where communities of people gathered together at some point in history and advanced human society or culture in one sudden leap. So, let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. One of my favorite examples is Cafe Procope in Paris. Cafe Procope opened in 1686, so pretty old. Still open, by the way, and it was created by the Sicilian chef Procopio Cuto. The cafe was successful because it was located across the street from a popular theater and because it served sorbet and coffee, which at the time was a fairly exotic beverage that had previously only been available in taverns. Cafe Procope was magical for many reasons. One reason is that it attracted people from many stations of life and professions, including writers, musicians, philosophers, scientists, and a whole bunch more. You can kind of think of it as kind of like the bar from Cheers, but imagine that sitting right next to Norm and Cliff were famous intellectuals like Voltaire or Diderot or Rousseau. So some of the people who rubbed shoulders at Cafe Procope decided to meet there and work on a project called the Encyclopedia, which is the first general encyclopedia. It had over 150 contributors, and its goal was to democratize knowledge by creating a reference work with articles summarizing everything that humans had learned in the sciences, technology, philosophy, and art up to that point in time. So, this publication is considered one of the landmark publications of the Age of Enlightenment, which was an intellectual and philosophical movement in Western Europe. This movement emphasized individual liberty, religious tolerance, and scientific reason. And this philosophy is at the root of our modern democratic government systems. So, from a certain point of view, if you enjoy the freedoms of democracy and basic human rights, then you can point back to Cafe Procope as one of those magical places that first created the conditions that made those ideas popular and compelling. That's magical. Through luck and chance encounters of the right people meeting in the right place at the right time, and then a whole lot of passion and work, something magical happened that changed the world for the better. And there have been other magical places in human history. Just to rattle off a few more, there's the Café Gerbois, also in Paris. I don't know if I pronounced that right. I don't speak French, but that's where the Impressionist painters regularly met on Thursdays and Sundays and basically revolutionized and democratized painting and art forever. Another magical place is Budapest, Hungary, where, for whatever reason, many of the world's most important scientists and mathematicians were born between the years 1890 and 1920, and they all happened to be in the same education system together. So some of the famous names from that included the Manhattan Project founder Leo Szilard, H-bomb creator Edward Teller, Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist Eugene Wigner, and legendary polymath John von Neumann. This coincidence about Budapest being the training ground for so many of the world's best mathematicians led Peter Lax to make the joke that you don't have to be a Hungarian to be a mathematician, but it helps. Leo Szilard, I want to share this just because it's funny, but who was one of the prominent mathematicians of this era, he jokingly put forward the theory that super intelligent Martian scouts must have landed in Budapest in the late 19th century and then mingled there with the local population. After about a generation, the Martians must have decided that our planet was unsuitable for their needs and then disappeared. And the only clue to their existence was the children they had with local women, aka the groups of scientists born in Budapest that eventually made up half the brain power behind 20th century physics. So, magical place, right? Okay, and one final example of a magical place was Laurel Canyon from 1965 to 75. That's a neighborhood that's located above Los Angeles, and this neighborhood happened to be a cheap place to live at the time. I'm pretty confident it's not cheap to live there anymore, but because it was cheap at the time, it attracted many of the aspiring musicians that would eventually form the nucleus of the folk rock art movement. I'm sure you've heard of at least one of them. It includes artists like the Byrds, the Doors, Mama Cass Elliot from the Mamas and the Papas, Joni Mitchell, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Carole King, James Taylor, the Eagles, Frank Zappa, Alice Cooper. I could go on and on and on. There's a lot more. And if you like any of the musicians that I just named, then you have the existence of Laurel Canyon to thank for that. So these are just a few of the magical places where communities of people gathered together for some purpose and then changed some aspect of the world. Now, one thing that has been accelerating over the last decade or more is that technology is making it so that we don't need a physical place to gather anymore. Starting in the 80s with the invention of the Linux GNU open source software projects, and then really ramping up with the development of new asynchronous communication technologies like GitHub and Slack and Zoom, it's now becoming possible to collaborate with large communities of people without being in the same physical location. That's kind of awesome because if you think about it, that means you don't have to live in Paris or Hungary or LA to have access to cool communities that you want to be a part of. So, why am I mentioning all this? What's the point? What does my weird fascination with magical places have to do with SaltConf? Well, if I may speak so boldly, I do believe that open source software communities in general are one of today's magical spaces in the same large and epic sense that I just defined it. Not all open source communities are healthy and vibrant, but some are. And I believe that SALT is one of those communities. And that's part of what has me so intrigued. I love figuring out why some places are magical, and that's what I'd like to explore in my talk today. So, my presentation is going to have three parts. In part one, I'll make my case that the SALT project is one of those magical places. And in this section of my talk, I'll explain what elements made the early SALT project a magical place. In the second part of my talk, I'll discuss how we can retain the magical elements that the early SALT community had, so that we can have a conversation about how to ensure the SALT project remains magical going forward. And then the last part of my presentation, I want to have a discussion with all of you about where to take the SALT community next. As a prelude to that discussion, I'll mention some interesting magical elements from other open source communities that I think could be inspirational for the future of the SALT community. So let's continue. Let's talk about the ways in which the early SALT community was magical. Well, SALT is part of the larger societal movement known as open source software, which I've already mentioned. In particular, it's part of the second wave of open source projects that were supercharged by the invention of the GitHub platform, which made OSS more accessible to an even wider population than it had been before. So, with that in mind, I decided to put on my SALT historian hat for this presentation, and I did some research into the history of the SALT community with many of the people who were part of that community from the very beginning. I had a lovely chat with three members of the early SALT community that included Dave Boucher, Gareth Greenaway, and C.R. Oldham. And I've gotten permission from them to share some video clips of our conversation here in my presentation today. So I hope you'll enjoy hearing from some of them personally. I have about 6 different clips to share. So, first off, one of the elements that made SALT magical is that it gave people an opportunity to work on solving a problem that mattered. Tom Hatch originally created the idea for the SALT project for the simple reason that he wanted to make his own job as a system administrator easier. He wanted to collect data and execute tasks remotely using a method that could scale to managing tens of thousands of nodes at a time really, really fast. He had tried to solve this problem before, but wasn't feeling satisfied with the existing technology at the time. So he decided to create his own system, which is SALT. Tom also decided to make SALT an open source project because he wanted to have access to this tool regardless of which job he was in or which client he was working with. He didn't want paying for licenses to be the barrier that prevented people from using SALT. So that was the first element. There was a need to create a tool that could solve a problem that really mattered. I really like the way CR expressed it, the nature of the problem in our interview. He said, wrangling servers is hard. We're going to make a tool that will make it so that you can go home at 5. I really like that. Freeing up system administrators from the boring stuff so they could that could be automated so that they could then focus on the higher level tasks that they really wanted to work on. That's a problem that really matters, and that's a problem that's worth solving. So the next element of SALT that was magical is that Tom and other members of the community were passionate about spreading the word about SALT to others. I'm going to share a clip from Dave Boucher talking about how Tom worked on getting other people interested in working on the project. Okay. Oh, actually, I need to. 1 second. Start with this clip.
To get a project off the ground, some of it's just luck, right?
Yeah.
But part of it's just being in the right place at the right time. And Tom is great at talking about SALT on and on and on. So Tom went to all kinds of conferences where he could go. In fact, he went down to Gareth's conference down in Southern California, had a booth there before there was even a company, it was just open source project. I went down there a number of times with him. He went to programmers groups. I met Tom at a Python meetup here in Utah, in Salt Lake City, actually in Murray at the time. And he presented on SALT, and then for the next 2 or 3 months after that, he'd just like talk about SALT after the official stuff was over, and we'd be there till late at night. Like they kick us out of we're at a library. They kicked us out of the library, and we're standing outside in the freezing snow, talking about SALT, and everyone's just like, what, around Tom, and he's just talking about SALT, SALT, SALT. And so there is some luck in just catching some momentum, but Tom also just was out there putting the name out, his name out there, the ideas, and people were attracted to that. And that's just a common thing at like all conferences Tom goes to. You'll find Tom in a hallway in a big room somewhere, circled with people, just holding court, just talking about SALT or just technology and geeky stuff. Whether that's a SALT specific conference or just wherever it might go. I mean, there's times like I literally felt like Tom's like handler, and I would like literally go and get food for him because he was starving. he had almost no breakfast. It's like 3 p.m. He hasn't any food. He's shaking, but he just can't stop talking about to all these people. And people would like love him. It's like being with a superstar, a rock star or something. People come running down the hallway. Oh, it's Tom Hatch, and he just connected with people and connected with people over technology, and people just wanted to be around him. And so people wanted to get involved there.
Okay, so as you can see from this clip, Tom was passionate about SALT and thoroughly enjoyed talking about it with others, and people were attracted to his vision for the tool and to the energy that he brought to it. And I found that this is often a key element of attracting people to an open source project. From my own experience, I've learned that one of my favorite ways to socialize with other people is by working together with them on a project or task that I care about. And I don't think I'm alone in that. The projects I've decided to join have been the ones where I looked at the core contributors to the project and said, those are the types of people I would love to work with. They seem like they're a lot of fun and they seem like people I could learn something from. And so, for that reason, it's important to make sure that your open source project is doing everything it can to attract those types of people to the project, and letting them also sometimes be the face of the the public face of the project, in order to attract other like-minded people to the project. So, notice I'm using the plural term "people" here because you need more than just one passionate and charismatic project member in order to be sustainable. Thankfully, SALT does have many dynamic and interesting project members like that in addition to Tom. So that's part of its success. So um, let's see. Oh, there we go. The next magical ingredient I want to mention is that SALT made a very deliberate effort to foster a friendly, welcoming, respectful, and fun community. This was a very conscious effort on the part of Tom and the early community members, and this even predated the concept of being a welcoming open source community. So that was very forward thinking for the time. One way that CR mentioned they did this was by being really, really open and accepting ideas from anyone. For example, they were pretty liberal about accepting pull requests from everyone in the early days. There was a pretty low barrier to entry at the time. The next clip I want to play illustrates a humorous example of how open and accepting they were of other pull requests in the early days of SALT. So
really funny kind of history. One of the few pull requests I think that we didn't accept was this guy wrote and you'll remember this, Dave, wrote an entire support for Windows, was it Windows Update?
Yeah, it was Windows Update.
And he did, and throughout the entire PR, everything was a Hogwarts Harry Potter reference. Nobody and nobody could understand it. And I remember Tom in the office one day said, he's like, "Oh, we so desperately need this, but there's just no way we can merge it because 2 weeks from now we're not going to have the slightest idea what is going on in here."
All the variables were Quidditch match terms.
Yeah, that's right.
All the commands too. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing that one. I remember like laughing and thinking like, "Oh my God, they're going to merge this in. This is like, oh my God, they merged in everything and they're going to merge this in." And then it didn't. It was just like, oh man, that's both good and sad at the same time.
Yeah.
It's like,
So one thing that this story illustrates is how fun and creative the early SALT community was, and accepting of nearly every idea up to that point. And on that note, I want to share one more clip on that theme. This next clip features Gareth Greenaway talking about his first pull request.
but I was a community member for probably a good portion of that. And it's like every single pull request, I still remember the very first pull request I ever put in, because like, if you ever hear like Tom on the Hacks, like, or any of the podcasts or Salt Airs where he references like a pull request that had like, I forget, like, I don't know, several 100 lines of code and like more lint errors than lines of code. That was my first pull request. And I always tell people like any other project out there, like you'd be like, if someone saw that, you'd be told like to take a hike, like get out of here, like, this is terrible. But like Tom's response, because like Tom still reviewed every single pull request back then, and his response was just like, "Oh look, hey, this is fantastic, thanks for doing this. We've got some lint errors here, let's get those fixed and get this merged." And like that was the reaction I got from every single pull request. And it wasn't just Tom, it was like whoever was reviewing it that day. It was just like, it was such a welcoming, such a friendly community. And that's what like kept me coming back and submitting code and just like, I don't know, it was such an enjoyable experience to contribute stuff. And like as CR said, like you never got turned away. Like some of the craziest stuff got in there early on. And like right, wrong, or indifferent, like it's a lot of it's still in there today. And a lot of it probably wouldn't make it in today just because we're more strict on what gets merged. Because we have to, like, at some point someone realized, like, wait a minute, we have to maintain all of this code. But yeah, I mean, and I think that attitude that Tom had, like, trickled down to everyone else and then trickled down into the community where like everyone was like, oh, I don't need to be a jerk. I don't need to be like hostile and harsh to like other people. I can be friendly and they'll be friendly to me.
In our discussion, Dave Boucher mentioned that because the core contributors really worked on being deliberately friendly, positive, and helpful, that set a tone for the rest of the community. And he mentioned that he could only remember one small incident of a community member making an inappropriate joke on the IRC channel. And he instantly had to say, hey, that's not okay here. We want to be sensitive. There's women in this community too. And the person who made that joke instantly apologized. And fortunately, it was the only incident they had like that in the early community, which is cool. Not all communities are always like that. So, and that brings me to, oops, wrong one, to the next magical element I want to discuss, which is the early SALT community grew by investing heavily in first-time contributors. They made a very conscious effort to lower the barrier to entry as much as they could and also to mentor new contributors. So I'm going to play another clip from Dave Boucher on this topic.
Well, a lot of times people just need help learning how to interact with an open source community. GitHub was fairly new still at that point. Not everybody had opened up a pull request and things like that. And that's one of the benefits of being open source is that they would often run into a problem and then they could dive into the Python code. And even if they weren't very good Python programmers, Python's often, depending on where you're at in the code, clear enough that you could go, oh, I think it's right here. So sometimes they show up in a Slack channel or send an email or even just open up an issue on GitHub and say, oh, hey, here's this one line, like this, you're missing a dot right here. Like sometimes it's that simple and they were able to find it. And so at first I'd be like, oh, okay. And I'd open a pull request and fix it. And then Tom was like, hey, help them go through the process. So sometimes I would literally say, okay, go to GitHub, create an account. All right, now go to our repo, fork it to your account, and just basically go through all the steps, helping them, go through the whole process of creating their own pull requests. And sometimes it's kind of a pain in the butt, but you do that, then you're enabling them to do the following one themselves. And so that whole process is, goes a lot smoother, and you don't have to babysit them every time.
So as Dave points out in this clip, sometimes it's a heavy effort to take the time to mentor first-time contributors and set up the structure or framework that will allow people to make contributions. But as much of a pain as it is, it's an effort that is worth it in the end. I feel like if you invest in your community members, then they will invest in you in return. And that is, sorry, I was distracted by that meeting invite. And that is something that benefits everybody in the end. So the next magical ingredient I want to mention is that because the community was such a great place and because the technology they were building was so useful, the SALT project began to attract power users and thought leaders from the industry. And so as a result, it began to have a positive feedback loop that improved the SALT project overall. I'm going to play one more. This one's a little bit longer. This has both Boucher and Gareth in it.
SALT really, the community really brought together a lot of expertise around the industry. Because there's so many times where you know, we would want to have a module that, like for example, one time I was working, somebody started, I can't remember if I did it from scratch or maybe someone started a MySQL module, but then kind of just like left it. And so I was adding some features to it and fixing bugs and just trying to get, I think I might start from scratch. But anyway, somebody from that used to work for MySQL organization or company happened to see it and like, oh wait, no, do it like this. Here, connect it with the Python the connector like this. And I can't even remember the details now.
Yeah.
But it made that module a lot better and faster and more, the MySQL way than I would have done it naturally. And there's a lot of that expertise that's kind of built into Salt because people are solving real world problems. A lot of our scaling type issues and stuff. We don't have 100,000 bare metal servers to test on. So like people from LinkedIn and even eBay and things like LinkedIn especially did some amazing work helping us scale and test things at scale that we may never have been able to do on our own, at least not without a lot of expense. And then even just like on smaller modules and things, there's things, we have features in there that like there's a Ruby on Rails and our BEM modules. Like I would never even care to even work on that. But we had that feature because someone wanted it and they did the work to make it happen. And
Yeah, because you were solving real world problems because you had that kind of breadth in your community across the industry. That's cool.
yeah,
Dave mentioned like conferences. I remember some of like the early Salt Conference, like the very first one I went to, was just such a great experience. Like me being in the same space as so many people that had like such a shared interest in like one technology, and like all the different stories, all the different like conversations you would have of people using like Salt. And so like one of the things I remember from my very first one was like just like having a conversation with someone, and I wasn't working for SaltStack yet, but just having a conversation with someone and like coming around in the conversation of like them mentioning something that I had contributed, and then them being like so excited, like, and me being so excited, just like meeting someone that was using code I wrote, and then being like really hesitant about like, oh, but we found this bug and like it doesn't do like what we're trying to do here. And I was like, I didn't even envision that someone would try and do it that way. Like, but that's an awesome use. Like we should fix that. And like us sitting over the next like hour or two, just like prepping a pull request to like submit it to like tune like this particular code to do what the community member was doing. And just like that stuff, like in the early days was just fun.
So as you can see, this community began to be a magical place where people exchanged ideas about how to use Salt effectively in a variety of contexts to solve practical, real-world system administration problems. And that's part of what makes open source so special. Normally, that information is kept proprietary and secret, but in this kind of open environment, Python developers and users in operations came together to build a tool that could better meet the industry's needs. I like a quote that Ciara gave in this session where he said, even if Salt wasn't the tool for them right then, they knew that it could become the tool that they could depend on. So they were motivated to invest in it for those reasons. Okay. The last magical element I want to mention is the SALT project empowered community members to make meaningful contributions. In order to be successful, a good open source project needs to attract active contributors. Active contributors, as opposed to casual contributors, are really important to any open source project. Active contributors make high quality commits because they have more context for the project. They stay with the community over the long term, and they begin to occupy a position of trust within the community. But not all contributors are created equal. So, how do you attract the good ones? Well, I really love a quotation from Nadia Egball's book, Working in Public, The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software. And if you know anything about me, you know that I love this book and I want everybody to read it. So hopefully this quote will get you interested in reading more. But she says, active contributors might look like casual contributors at first, but their motives are different. During their first month, active contributors tend to exhibit pro social attitudes, demonstrating a higher level of motivation to help others. Active contributors who stick around do so not because they successfully made their first contribution, but because they came in with the intent to stick around. In other words, they were never really casual contributors in the first place. Any active contributor is often motivated by a desire for community, but they might also have secondary motivations around reputation and learning. They enjoy the social aspects of the project and they want to feel as though they're part of something. So I'm going to share one last clip from my conversation with Gareth, and I want you to kind of keep this quotation in mind because I think you'll see those elements at work here.
But one of the things that I remember early on, like even as a community member, was like people had, and for the most part, I think it's still there. But you had like a sense of ownership over like a certain part of like your contributions, like what the stuff that you contributed, you were kind of the subject matter expert on that particular area of the code. And so like even community members, and we still do this to this day. Like, if someone is better versed in the code than anyone on the core team, we'll call them out and say like, oh, hey, like you know this code better than we do. What do you think here? And so like that, as I said, like that sense of ownership over like the project
Really made you feel invested. Yeah.
Yeah, it just makes you feel like you're part of the team. I mean, like CR was saying, when he joined the company, like he felt part of the tribe from day one. And I think that feeling kind of extended into the community as well. Like once you joined the project, once you were involved, once you submitted your pull request, once you were kind of maintaining a bit of it, you were part of the group, whether or not you worked for the company or not. You were part of the group.
So as you can see from this clip, contributors like Gareth have pro-social motivations. They're motivated by a desire to be part of a community and part of something meaningful. So it's important to the success of the project to be able to ensure that your open source project meets those needs. I'm talking about deeper needs like a need for community, for opportunities to learn and grow professionally, and ultimately to make a difference. And I think that those elements were there in the early days of Salt, which is why it was a magical place. That's why it has more than 2,000 contributors, why it has more than 5,000 forks, and why it's been started on GitHub more than 12,000 times. So now I want to turn my attention to the future Salt community. I want to make it clear that I think that the present Salt community still retains many of these qualities that made this early community a magical place. And yes, a few things did have to change about how the community was run in order to reduce tech debt and to ensure code quality and to accommodate the sheer scale of the number of people who now use Salt. And some of those changes did mean that the barrier to entry for contributing to the Salt project got a lot higher, unfortunately. But still, at the end of the day, many of these magical elements are still here. But where do we go from here? How do we continue to grow? And how do we continue on this trajectory to advance system administration technology? Well, one area where I think we have some untapped potential is in DevOps. So many of you know what DevOps is, so I won't go into depth, but DevOps is the combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools from software development and infrastructure management, aka operations. The overall goal of DevOps as an approach or a methodology is to increase an organization's ability to deliver applications and services at a higher velocity. The rest of my slide gives a brief summary of DevOps if you're not familiar with these concepts already, and I'll just assume that you are. So the field of DevOps is still new enough that the SALT community hasn't really tapped into this field as much as it has the potential to. From what I understand, the early SALT community seemed to really attract the dev side of DevOps a little bit more because it attracted a lot of Python developers who were interested in SALT because they saw it as kind of a fun and interesting Python project to work on. But as we saw from my little history lesson there, clearly SALT has also attracted operations folks as core users of the tool. So for this reason, I hope this isn't heretical to say, I'm just spinning ideas, but I feel like the SALT project could be something more than just a community that is dedicated to one tool or one technology. It could be a place where folks from development and operations could congregate together to share best practices and exchange ideas, just like they've been naturally doing in the first 8 years of the SALT project. But what I would like to see is a little bit more of a return to some of that that thought leadership and collaboration that was at the heart of the community. And I think that could then, in turn, inform development on SALT as a tool because we could build out the technology that supports the best practices and methodologies that might come out of those conversations. Um, I always think of my colleague Patrick Moffat, who often talks about what he calls the salty way, which implies that there's a methodology or approach to implementing DevOps in a particular way using SALT. What if we as a community seriously developed out that methodology? That would be a really interesting project for us to work on, and it would ultimately make SALT a better tool at the end of the day. So let me take one small detour to talk about the good work being done in other open source communities that I think could benefit SALT either directly or indirectly. One of the communities that I'm part of is the Write the Docs community, which is an open source-ish free community for technical writers and doc ops professionals who get together to exchange ideas and best practices. One of the things that's super interesting about Write the Docs is that originally this community was meant to support one tool, the open source Python based Read the Docs documentation platform. But over time, Write the Docs evolved way beyond the Read the Docs tool. Today, it's a global professional community of technical writers that meet together to grow their social network and to improve at the craft of documentation. Just to give you a little bit of context, a good chunk of the technical writers who have been hired to work on SALT and SALT Stack Config have come to us by way of the Write the Docs community. And it really is where many of the key players and thought leaders in the technical writing profession are collaborating these days. So could the SALT project expand in the same way? Could we become a place where ideas and best practices are exchanged for DevOps? That's one idea. Now, another technical writing community that I'm part of is the Good Docs project. This is a project that is getting together to create templates and tools and guides to help improve documentation in open source software. And the main thing that I want to mention about this community is our mentorship structures. One of the key projects we're working on is creating high quality templates that can be easily incorporated into an open source project by people who are developers and who are not professional technical writers. So the way I like to put it is if you remember how testing wasn't considered a baseline of quality for open source 10 years ago, but now it most definitely is. We in our project would like to see the same thing happen for documentation, essentially. So our project has an interesting mix of technical writers and both experienced and new and non-technical writers who, and the way we kind of navigate those mixed groups is we have template writing groups, which are groups where that are led by an experienced template mentor that meet together once a week to talk about the template project they're working on. And each templateer has just a little space of time each week to show us what they've been working on and get advice from the other writers. And honestly, being part of these groups is magical for me. They remind me of poetry circles of the past where you would get together and read your poetry and get feedback on your work together. But it's also a fun way to socialize and improve the craft of technical writing together while also creating something that would be useful to a larger community. And if you'll indulge me, I want to give a shout out to Dee Thompson, who is our new SALT Stack config writer, who I met through this group and encouraged her to apply for this job. So Yay. But anyway, these mentor groups are designed to scale to larger sizes as needed. And I can give more detail on that, but I think I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. But my point in mentioning these template working groups is that our project has innovated a really great way to make mentorship models that scale for large groups. And the way this could apply to the SALT project is DevOps is a field that could use some mentorship. There are limits to what you can learn about system administration from reading a book or taking a class. That's not to knock the importance of formal education, but in many ways, I feel like society could benefit from bringing back older knowledge transfer structures like apprenticeship models, where an experienced sysadmin could mentor less experienced admins and then teach them the tools of the trade. And maybe SALT could be that kind of a community where mentorship opportunities for DevOps could happen. So one last thought, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, the community, to talk. The last open source community I want to mention is Carvel, which is actually another VMware sponsored open source project that comes from the Tanzu side of the company, Kubernetes type stuff. My knowledge of this community is still very new and very raw, so I am by no means an expert, but I see a lot of possible touch points for collaboration between SALT and Carvel. Carvel is very much interested in creating the next generation of DevOps tools. So they've been in this mind space for a while now, which is cool. And from the superficial glance I've given to their tools and the conversation that I've had, it seems like there are promising ways in which SALT and Carvel could collaborate and integrate together. For example, one of their tools is YTT, which is a linting tool for making well-formed YAML code that can drop in pre-formed YAML structures for doing common tasks. So a tool like that could have an awesome application for writing SALT state files. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Again, it's just a superficial glance that I've did a few conversations, but it makes me think that there could be a really nice collaboration between these two projects. And that's another open source community that's worth exploring. Okay, so I'm done talking now, and I'm going to invite Dave back onto the stage to help us moderate the rest of the session. We've got about 7 minutes left, so that's cool. I've thrown a bunch of crazy ideas out there, kind of like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. Let's have a conversation now in the chat, but also if you're open to, you could ask to share your audio and video if you want. And let's have a conversation about the future of the SALT community and how it could be a community for DevOps professionals or otherwise. So the time is now yours.
While they're thinking about that, great presentation. Yeah, I love the ideas from Carvel, Good Docs, the apprenticeship, the high quality templates. Also, just kind of curious to see what other things the audience thinks is part of the secret sauce that maybe wasn't mentioned.
So I'm going to just dump in some links here really fast. Oh, it's formatted weird in this, but sorry, that's a big dump and it's a mess formatting wise, but there's some links. So you can see Carvel there and the Good Docs project and write the docs. So anyway.
So Hans has a comment there. Mentorship is great, but attention must be given to preventing this is how we always have done it, why change attitude. Companies with a very strong mentorship system also tend to be extremely conservative, and that holds them back.
That's very interesting. I could see that. That sometimes those mentorship structures could create a fortress-like mentality of like protecting from other ideas, which we definitely do not want to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's interesting.
Peter says, it discourages contributors is the delay for a PR to walk. Does any plan to help with that?
Can I get some more clarification on, I'm sorry, I'm not up on my GitHub lingo. What do you mean by having a PR walk?
I see the meeting.
Okay, Hans, no worries. I'm guessing, maybe you can clarify, Peter, that yes, yeah. So maybe like the time from opening the PR to the time it gets merged and not having that be way too long. That is definitely an issue. Yeah. PR is pull request, yes. Although maybe it's public relations too, in a way.
I think you can kind of intertwine that delay right into it. Kind of hurts the new contributors and feeling the ownership and all the other kind of attributes that you pointed out earlier. Might be not as satisfied with that kind of delay.
Yeah. I see that Boucher and Gareth are in the session today. I'm just saying, if you want to come and join us on the stage, I will not turn you away.
Oops, here's Gareth. And
Hey, Gareth,
so
you were like
I
a
was.
ghost presenter in my
Oh
you were a
yeah,
ghost panel. So is Boucher in my presentation today. So
I was
thanks
I
for
was
joining.
jokingly I was gonna jokingly say it because I was thinking about it. Like it's like I was doing another session, another talk session,
Yes,
but not
exactly.
really doing a talk session. Um, I actually started typing out a response, or not a response, but like some I guess my thoughts on Peter's comments about PRs walking. That is a huge problem with open source projects, and we are no different. The problem is like just people power. Unfortunately, like we have so many PRs to review, and only so many like hours and time in the day to do it. And in terms of like getting a PR reviewed, it's unfortunate, but the squeaky wheel gets the grease in this case. So I would say like just always keep bugging us like um, on open hours. Like, I mean, this is Salt specific, obviously. Like on open hours, just tell us like, oh, hey, like when it comes to the time of when we ask for like public comments or just like anything people want to talk to us about or questions they want to raise, just like mention, oh, hey, this pull request has been sitting here for a couple weeks. Is there anything I need to do to get it merged? Or as we get closer to a release, just bug us because chances are it simply slipped through the cracks, and it's not that we don't want the contribution. It's just that it slipped someone's attention for whatever reason. Most often life is the reason, but yeah, that's my bit of advice for it. And Peter says you already did that. Okay. I guess, yeah, send me a Slack DM on community Slack, and I'll take a look and try and get it in there. Hopefully it wasn't something that you wanted for Silicon.
So attend SaltConf, get on the call, get on the meeting with Gareth, and bam, you're in.
That's the fast track to getting your PR. Just kidding. It's all good. Boucher,
Yeah,
is
just
there
please don't.
anything? Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, please don't escalate it to the point where you show up on my front doorstep with like a laptop and be like, "Can you review this PR?"
That's a little
That's
too
taking
far.
it too far. Too far. Boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah, Gareth or Boucher, anything you wanted to add? I was putting words in your mouth and riffing on what you said, but anything from the presentation that you'd like to add today?
Well, one thing I've seen is that our project has gone from just a few members to thousands of PRs. Is like now there's more requirements for tests to be added to PRs and things. It has created a little bit of a higher hurdle to get over. And there's things we can do, I think, to still improve that, but that's just a necessity of the sheer massive amounts of code that we have to maintain and keep going forward. And so, but Salt is still a very inviting place to be. It still is a great place to learn how to interact with an open source community, and all those roots are still there. The organization has grown up quite a bit over the years, and there's still plenty of room for improvement. And that's the wonderful thing about it, is that if there is some place where we're falling short, and there are many, we'd love to have you help out. There's all kinds of places for help with documentation, improvement in modules, bug fixes, answering people's questions in the Slack channel or an email list. All those types of things are really important, because Gareth can only answer so many questions in a day. He can only fix so many bugs in a week, and it's just not physically possible for one person to. There's more than one person working on Salt, but the point is there's a lot to do there. So if we're falling short, please jump in. We really encourage and love when community members volunteer and help out, because that's one of the pillars of how Salt has become such a large and powerful organization, is the community.
Did you use pillar on purpose? Like that's a wing?
No, as I said that, I was like, oh, and I'm going to confuse people even more.
Pun intended.
Yeah, that was unintended.
I was gonna say, like, one of the things that I thought of when you were using the example that Dave had mentioned when we had chatted about the community, how kind of shutting down kind of negative bad actor community members. One of the things that has been really good for me to see over the years of being part of the community is how self-correcting it has become. We've never seen anything as bad as some open source communities have gotten, and I think that's because people self-correct each other. Like if someone sees someone, like a good example was when we had a really nasty CVE security bug last year, like really bad, and a lot of people were understandably upset in it, and some people were getting quite angry, and the community, a lot of the community members were stepping in and being kind of tampering down the anger and kind of settling people down. So that was really good to see that the community was self-correcting itself, and we the core team, or Salt Stack employees at the time, didn't need to put out the fires everywhere, because the community itself was jumping in. So. And I think that goes back to just the point that I made in one of my comments about just the sense of ownership. When you're part of this community, you have a sense of ownership, not just over the code itself, but over the community as well.
Yeah, that you're part of the tribe. You can join the community and be part of us. So. Yeah, I want to comment. Dale said, I'd like to see more documentation for Windows. It would help I would help contribute if I knew where to get started. That's something that, going back to lowering the barrier to entry, documentation is a really key part of that. Being able to have an entry point for the project, both as a user and as a contributor. And I totally agree. And right now, I'm not yet the Salt technical writer. I will be soon. But what I am doing right now is kind of building out a documentation roadmap. Like what should we tackle first? And I have gotten requests from my Windows users to give more Windows support. And so that request has been heard and logged and will be built into the roadmap.
So we're about at time. Before we go, Alyssa, is there any, how can someone reach you if they want to continue the conversation or have a question?
That's a good question, and I was trying to decide how to answer that. I think anywhere you can talk about salt is where you can find me. So if you join the salt community Slack workspace, I am very available there, very responsive there. So that's the best way to reach me. But if you really want to come over to my open source project at the Good Docs, you can most definitely reach me there as well. But mostly through the salt Slack is the best way to get in touch with me. So.
Awesome. Great presentation, Gareth, Dave. Thanks for ghost presenting. And with that, I think we'll call it a wrap. Thanks for
Thanks.
thanks for watching.